The pyramids. China doesn't talk about. In 1945, an American military pilot flying a supply route over the Shaanxi Province of central China looked down and saw something that stopped him cold. Spread across the valley floor below were dozens of large pyramid-shaped mounds, some, by his estimate, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. He photographed what he could and reported what he had seen. The story was published in a New York newspaper in 1947 and then largely forgotten. What the pilot had seen was real. China's Shaanxi Province contains more than 100 imperial burial mounds dating from the Qin and Han dynasties, constructed between roughly 250 BC and 200 AD. Several are genuine pyramidal earthworks of substantial scale. They are not secret, exactly. Chinese archaeologists have studied them for decades, but they are restricted, poorly documented in international literature, and almost entirely unknown to the global public that knows the Egyptian pyramids by name. Based on archaeological excavation records and historical documentation, this is the story of China's pyramidal tombs, what they are, who built them, and why the world has taken so long to notice. The aerial sighting that introduced Chinese burial mounds to Western popular consciousness came from James Gaussman, a United States Army Air Forces pilot flying supply missions over China during the final years of the Second World War. In 1945, Gaussman reported observing a large white pyramid from the air while flying over the Wei River Valley in Shaanxi Province, describing it as enormous, larger than any structure he had seen, with what appeared to be a glistening white capstone. His account was followed by a similar report from another pilot, Maurice Sheehan, whose description was published by the New York Times in March 1947 alongside a photograph. The publication caused brief but genuine excitement in Western archaeological circles. China's imperial burial traditions were known in outline, but the scale and number of the mounds described in the pilot's accounts exceeded what most Western scholars had assumed. The Chinese government of the time, engaged in civil war and not inclined toward international archaeological cooperation, did not respond formally. The story faded from Western attention within a few years. What Gaussman and Sheehan had seen was not a mystery to Chinese historians. The Wei River Valley near the ancient capital Xi'an, known in earlier periods as Chang'an, had been recognized as a major imperial necropolis for centuries. Chinese historical records documented the burial mounds of the Qin and Han dynasties in considerable detail, including their locations, the emperors interred within them, and the enormous resources devoted to their construction. The mounds had not been hidden. They had simply not been communicated to an international audience in a form that registered. The Guanzhong Plain of central Shaanxi, the flat valley floor through which the Wei River flows before joining the Yellow River, served as the heartland of Chinese imperial power for more than 1,000 years. The Qin dynasty, which unified China under Qin Shi Huang in 221 BC, was based here, as was the succeeding Han dynasty that ruled for 4 centuries after it. The valley contains the ruins of multiple ancient capitals, including the sites of Qin's capital Xianyang and Han's capital Chang'an, and the surrounding hills and plains are densely populated with imperial tombs spanning several centuries of continuous use. Chinese imperial burial practice in the Qin and Han periods was not simply a matter of interring a body. It was a comprehensive statement of cosmological and political belief, a construction project intended to replicate the conditions of the living court in an underground realm where the emperor would continue to reign after death. The resources devoted to this belief were extraordinary. Historical records indicate that construction of the tomb of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang involved hundreds of thousands of workers over several decades, drawing on the full administrative and economic capacity of the unified Chinese state. The mounds themselves, the visible above-ground structures, were constructed from tamped earth, a building technique that Chinese engineers had developed to a high level of sophistication over millennia. Layers of soil were compacted to achieve a density and structural integrity that could support very large masses and resist erosion. The resulting structures, built in a stepped, pyramidal form, were designed to be permanent landscape features, visible from considerable distances, marking the emperor's burial location while also serving as focal points for ongoing ritual activities. The most immediate question a Western observer brings to the Chinese burial mounds: why earth rather than stone when the Egyptian pyramids used cut limestone blocks? Reflects a genuine difference in engineering tradition rather than a difference in capability or ambition. Chinese construction culture from its earliest documented periods favored rammed earth as the primary structural material for large-scale projects, a preference rooted in both the available materials of the North China Plain and in a deep-seated technical mastery of earthwork engineering. The technique known in Chinese as hangtu, compressed or pounded earth, involves depositing soil in thin layers and compacting each layer by repeated pounding with heavy tools before adding the next. The result is a material of considerable density and compressive strength, resistant to the kind of settling and deformation that uncompacted fill would experience. Chinese city walls, palace platforms, and flood control embankments from the Neolithic period onward used hangtu construction, and the technique was applied to imperial burial mounds at the same scale as any other major construction project of the era. The practical consequence of building burial mounds in earth rather than stone is that they are considerably more vulnerable to erosion and to the biological processes, root growth, burrowing animals, soil chemistry, that slowly break down any earthwork. Over 2,000 years, without active maintenance, most of the Shaanxi mounds have lost their original sharp geometric profiles and acquired rounded, naturalistic forms that can be difficult to distinguish from natural hills at ground level. Satellite imagery and ground survey have been necessary to establish the full inventory of mounds in the region, precisely because so many have been substantially modified by time. The specific feature that most captured Western popular imagination from the pilot's accounts was the description of a white or pale-colored capstone on the largest mound, a glistening surface visible from altitude, implying a material different from the surrounding earth. This detail has generated considerable speculation about whether Chinese imperial tombs were topped with jade, polished stone, or other precious materials, and has been the focal point of claims about a white pyramid of extraordinary size somewhere in Shaanxi. The factual basis for the white capstone observation is ambiguous. The photograph published by Shihan in 1947 shows a mound that appears lighter in color than its surroundings, but photographic analysis has not produced a definitive identification of the material responsible. Possibilities range from exposed limestone bedrock at the mound's summit to local soil types with high mineral content that appear pale from altitude, to seasonal effects like frost or snow visible at the time of observation. None of these possibilities involves precious materials, and none requires a construction more remarkable than the mounds themselves already are. German author Hartwig Hausdorff visited the Shaanxi region in the 1990s and published accounts claiming to have located a very large mound fitting the White Pyramid description, with photographs that some researchers have found compelling and others have attributed to misidentification of known mounds or deliberate exaggeration. Hausdorff's work is not peer-reviewed, and his claims have not been confirmed by Chinese or international academic sources. The mainstream archaeological position is that the White Pyramid, as a distinct, extraordinary structure separate from the known inventory of imperial mounds, is not supported by the available evidence. The restrictions on access to the Shaanxi burial mounds, which have been cited as evidence of deliberate concealment in popular accounts, have straightforward explanations that do not require a conspiracy to suppress historical knowledge. Understanding them requires some context about how China manages its archaeological heritage and about the specific challenges the mounds present. The primary reason that the major Shaanxi mounds have not been excavated is a deliberate policy decision by Chinese archaeological authorities based on conservation concerns, not on a desire to hide what is inside. The experience of the terracotta warriors' discovery in 1974, where the famous ceramic soldiers were found by farmers digging a well near Qin Shi Huang's tomb, provided a cautionary lesson. The initial excavation exposed thousands of irreplaceable artifacts to conditions, air, humidity, light, that caused significant deterioration before adequate conservation infrastructure was in place. The colored pigment that originally decorated the warriors faded or disappeared within minutes of exposure to air. Conservation science has since advanced considerably, but the lesson about the irreversibility of excavation damage was absorbed by Chinese archaeological policy. The official position of the Chinese State Administration of Cultural Heritage is that Qin Shi Huang's tomb and the other major unexcavated mounds should remain sealed until conservation technology has advanced to the point where excavation can be conducted without damaging what is found. This is a defensible, scientific and ethical position. It is not evidence of concealment, it is evidence of caution in the face of irreversible decisions about irreplaceable objects. The construction of the large Shaanxi burial mounds required organizational and engineering capacity comparable to other major ancient construction projects, and the historical record of how that capacity was deployed is actually better documented for Chinese imperial tombs than for most ancient structures of comparable scale. The Qin and Han dynasties maintained detailed administrative records, and portions of those records survive. Documents recovered from archaeological sites, including the Qin Administrative Archive at Liye in Hunan Province, provide specific information about labor allocation, material procurement, and project management in the Qin period. They show a state capable of mobilizing and directing very large workforces across multiple simultaneous large-scale projects. The tomb of the first emperor was under construction at the same time as the Great Wall and the Lingkou Canal, all drawing on the same administrative and labor systems. The hangtu earthwork technique used in the burial mounds was implemented at a level of precision that modern engineering analysis has confirmed. Core samples taken from intact sections of mound structure show consistent layer thicknesses and compaction density across large areas, indicating systematic process control rather than ad hoc construction. The outer profiles of the better preserved mounds show geometric regularity, consistent with deliberate shaping to achieve specific slope angles. Non-invasive investigation of the Shaanxi burial mounds using modern geophysical methods has produced substantial information about their internal structure without requiring excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic survey techniques have all been applied to the major mounds, and the results have been published in peer-reviewed journals by Chinese and international research teams. The investigation of Qin Shi Huang's tomb is the most extensively documented. A major survey published in 2016 in the journal Scientific Reports, conducted by a team including researchers from the University of Edinburgh, used muon tomography, a technique that uses naturally occurring cosmic ray particles to map dense structures, similar in principle to X-ray imaging, but capable of penetrating much greater thicknesses of material. The survey confirmed the presence of a large underground chamber beneath the mound's center, with walls showing higher density than the surrounding earth, consistent with the use of fired brick or stone in the tomb chamber's construction. Earlier ground-penetrating radar surveys had identified an extensive system of underground passages and chambers surrounding the central burial area, consistent with the description in Sima Qian's historical account of the tomb's construction. Sima Qian, writing approximately a century after the first emperor's death, described underground waterways of Mercury, representations of the celestial bodies on the ceiling, and comprehensive replicas of the emperor's palaces and court. Geochemical analysis of soil samples from above the tomb area has detected mercury concentrations significantly above background levels, consistent with the presence of large quantities of liquid mercury in the chambers below, lending credibility to at least part of Sima Qian's account. The question of whether the pyramidal form of Chinese imperial burial mounds reflects any connection to the pyramid-building traditions of Egypt or other ancient cultures is one that popular accounts raise repeatedly, and that archaeologists have examined with specific evidence. The conclusion of that examination is clear. The Chinese mound-building tradition developed independently, from a distinct cultural and technological root, with no documented connection to Egyptian or Mesopotamian pyramid construction. The earliest Chinese burial mounds predate the Qin dynasty by centuries. Mound burial was practiced by several pre-imperial Chinese cultures, including the states of the Warring States period that preceded unification. The tradition grew from a combination of Chinese cosmological beliefs about the afterlife, the practical requirements of marking an emperor's burial location, and the engineering tradition of Hangtu earthwork construction that had been in continuous development since the Neolithic period. None of these routes requires external influence. The visual similarity between Chinese burial mounds and Egyptian pyramids, both being large structures with roughly pyramidal profiles, reflects the mathematical and physical reality that a stable pile of earth or stone tends toward a pyramidal shape regardless of where it is built. The angle of repose of compacted earth produces a similar slope angle in Shaanxi and in Egypt, not because of cultural contact, but because physics is consistent. The similarity is geometric coincidence rather than evidence of connection. The decision not to excavate Qin Shi Huang's central burial chamber means that the most direct evidence of what the tomb contains remains inaccessible. But the combination of historical records, geophysical survey results, and the evidence provided by excavated portions of the surrounding complex allows a reasonably detailed picture to be assembled. Sima Qian's account, written in the records of the Grand Historian around 90 BC, describes a tomb chamber of extraordinary elaboration. A model of the empire's geography rendered in miniature, with rivers of flowing mercury representing the actual rivers. Astronomical representations on the ceiling replicating the night sky. Automatic crossbow triggers set to fire at anyone who entered. Candles made from whale oil, calculated to burn for very long periods. The emperor himself surrounded by the treasures and administrative apparatus of his court. Whether every element of this description is accurate, exaggerated, or partly legendary cannot be determined without excavation. But the mercury evidence and the geophysical surveys confirm that the underground chamber is real and substantial. Excavated Han Dynasty tombs elsewhere in China provide additional context. The tomb of Lady Dai at Mawangdui in Hunan Province, excavated in 1972, produced one of the best preserved ancient human bodies in the world, alongside silk garments, musical instruments, food offerings, and documents of extraordinary quality, preserved by a combination of careful sealing, charcoal insulation, and the specific conditions maintained within the tomb structure. The comparable or greater resources devoted to imperial-scale Han tombs in Shaanxi suggest that the unexcavated mounds contain material culture of at least equivalent significance. The story of China's burial mounds is ultimately a story about the pace of historical knowledge and the institutional frameworks that control it. The mounds have been there for 2,000 years. Chinese scholars have known about them for most of that time. The rest of the world has had access to satellite imagery showing them for decades. And yet they remain largely unexcavated, poorly known internationally, and wrapped in a popular mythology of concealment that the actual facts do not support. The conservation argument for leaving Qin Shi Huang's tomb sealed is genuine and has been accepted by most of the international archaeological community that has engaged with it. The 2016 muon tomography study, conducted in collaboration between Chinese and international researchers, represents the kind of cooperative scientific work that is gradually building a more complete picture of the mound's contents without the irreversible commitment of excavation. More such work is planned, and the methodological toolkit available for non-invasive investigation continues to expand. The popular narrative of Chinese government suppression and hidden truths distorts a more mundane reality. A country managing an enormous and irreplaceable archaeological heritage under difficult conservation conditions, with legitimate concerns about the damage that premature excavation has caused at other sites, and with bureaucratic frameworks for international access that are imperfect but not sinister. The restrictions are real. The reasons behind them are not mysterious.